Okay, given the amount of time that remains, I'm unlikely to be able to get through more than this chapter, but it's fine because it will set the stage for then chapters 3 and 4, Conspicuous Leisure, Conspicuous Consumption. And if I have time at the end, I'll try to make sure I do, just to briefly talk about what he's doing in those two chapters. But let's look at chapter 2, pecuniary emulation. So emulating, or the desire to emulate wealth is essentially what's going on. Wealth, the emulation that's triggered by wealth. So let's read what he says. In the sequence of cultural evolution, the emergence of a leisure class coincides with the beginning of ownership. So stage 1 is setting out the groundwork for how we can eventually observe the emergence of this upper class that's characterized by not working. That the emergence of that class happens at the same time as we establish ownership, right? The principle of owning private property. Well, we know when that happens because ownership is a necessary artifact of permanent settled communities, right? Once we moved into permanent settlement, at that point we also established the principle of ownership because now you have stuff to own, right? You build a house, it's yours. You have stuff, you can store it, becomes yours. So we know that ownership, or the concept of private property, links to a specific phase of human development. So that's what he's saying. It's at that phase that we have the true leisure class. He says this is necessarily the case for ownership and the leisure class result from the same set of economic forces. In the inchoate phase of their development, they are but different aspects of the same general facts of social structure. So inchoate in this case means while it's still being formed. Right? So you'll see a little bit later on, he says, the point in question is the origin and nature of a conventional leisure class on the one hand and the beginnings of individual ownership as a conventional right or equitable claim on the other. Let's determine what he means by the nature of conventional. Conventional meaning established by convention, something that we all agree, right? So for example, private property rights are not sort of a universal truth. Private property rights exist, or private property exists by convention. We agree that there is such a thing as private property, and we have elaborate mechanisms to respect the idea of private property. So the early differentiation out of which the distinction between a leisure and a working class arises is a division maintained between men's and women's work in the lower stages of barbarism. So we've already covered that, right? Hope that's all clear. So as we're coming out of that stage into settled communities, already we're carrying with us then this sort of gradation in terms of the value of work, and that gradation is itself gendered. Likewise, the earliest form of ownership is an ownership of the women by the able-bodied men of the community. The facts may be expressed in more general terms, and truer to the import of the barbarian theory of life by saying that it is an ownership of the woman by the man. And you'll recall that we've also explored this phenomenon in our class when we looked at our question of patriarchy, right? Because the whole argument that Lerner presents is that patriarchy rests upon the idea of asserting monopoly rights, not over the female body, but over female reproduction. Remember that discussion that we had in order to secure paternal certainty for your inheritance, right, or for your heirs. So we've already then observed that this notion of ownership built around the principle of exercising monopoly rights across a gender divide, we've also seen that link then to this stage. So, and I should note, by the way, if this strikes you as something quite interesting for someone to be writing at the end of the 19th century, it's because Veblen had clearly read Marx and Engels the discussion that we have about monopoly rights over female reproduction comes from a text that Friedrich Engels wrote at the late 19th century on essentially the emergence of class along this family gender divide. So that's where this is coming from. He's read his Engels. Okay, so just the idea then, we've established this concept of ownership. So let's move a little forward. Wherever the institution of private property is found, even in slightly developed form, the economic process bears the character of a struggle between men for the possession of goods. As soon as I establish the right to own things, the economic environment around me is then characterized by competition between people to own things, right? That's what private property does, is it creates an incentive to acquire private property. Now, the question that he has for us is why? Why do we struggle to acquire private property, right? That's the argument that's here. So he says, if we take a classical economic point of view, we would argue that this struggle for wealth is essentially a struggle for subsistence, that we acquire private property because it facilitates our ability to keep ourselves alive. That's the kind of classical economic point of view, classical economics being, for when he was writing, 19th century, like Ricardian economics. But, he notes, in all progressing communities, an advance is presently made beyond this early stage of technological development. Industrial efficiency is presently carried to such a pitch as to afford something appreciably more than a bare livelihood to those engaged in the industrial process. It has not been unusual for economic theory to speak of the further struggle for wealth on this new industrial basis as a competition for an increase of the comforts of life, primarily for an increase of the physical comforts which the consumption of goods affords. So that the struggle for wealth quickly overwhelms a mere subsistence motivation and now starts to satisfy a greater need, or the needs of comfort beyond merely that which is needed to keep yourself alive, right? So that the competition maintains even as you have satisfied that basic condition. Okay. The end of acquisition and accumulation is conventionally held to be the consumption of the goods accumulated. End in this case meaning the objective, right? Why do I acquire and accumulate? Conventionally, people think that it's because I want to consume what I am acquiring and accumulating, right? So that's the idea, that I buy things in order to consume them. And this is where Veblen makes a kind of very critical contribution to the literature, because he changes our notion of consumption. He says it is only when taken, in a sense, far removed from its naive meaning that consumption of goods can be said to afford the incentive from which accumulation invariably proceeds. The motive that lies at the root of ownership is emulation, and the same motive of emulation continues active in the further development of the institution to which it has given rise and in the development of all those features of the social structure which this institution of ownership touches. The possession of wealth confers honor. It is an invidious distinction. Let's translate this into English and use a simple example. So, what's your name? Diego. So when Diego becomes a very successful entrepreneur, makes himself a bunch of cash and stuff like this, what's he going to want to do? He's going to want to buy himself a top-of-the-line BMW. That goes without saying. I don't know what the top of the line is. Maybe a 700 series or something with all the trimmings. Maybe a Bugatti as well, a Porsche and something like that. And he's going to park them in front of his fucking house, man. And what he wants, right, in order for, how is he consuming the goods? He's not consuming them as you would think, driving them around, although that's part of it, right? Window down, arm out, tunes blasting, right? Listening to some kind of, I don't know, death rap on the radio. That is part of the consumption, but that's not the real part of the consumption. What's he really consuming? He's consuming when Mario walks by his house and thinks, that guy's a fucking prick with all of his cars, right? He's feeding on the jealousy. That's what he wants, right? He wants that sense of, I'm better than you. That's the consumption that is really there. So when he says, it's not this naive consumption, he's not buying the Bugatti to drive. He's like, why did you buy a Bugatti? Well, I got to have a car to get to the grocery store. No, right? Why didn't you buy a Honda Civic? Because the nature of the car, right, attaches to himself, and the whole purpose of it is for it to be seen, just like the teeth that were worn around Jonas's neck. And the purpose then is to, as it were, not to create the invidious comparison, but to demonstrate in the context of this competition, I am successful, right? That's the purpose of it. And you can think for yourself, would you bother spending a lot of money to buy a luxury product if no one would ever see you consume or wear it? And the answer is probably not. Wouldn't be worth the money. So the consumption changes, right? Possession of wealth confers honor. It is an invidious distinction. Nothing equally cogent can be said for the consumption of goods, nor for any other conceivable incentive to acquisition, and especially not for any incentive to the accumulation of wealth. So when we purchase these goods, what we're consuming is not the good itself, but the nature of the good inside of this system, which is driven by a form of pecuniary, what he calls pecuniary emulation, right? That sort of that sense of other people wanting to emulate your wealth. Ownership began and grew into a human institution on grounds unrelated to the subsistence minimum. The dominant incentive was from the outset the invidious distinction attaching to wealth, and save temporarily and by exception, no other motive has usurped the primacy at any later stage of development. That's an interesting point, right? At least assertion that ownership has always been linked to this desire to accumulate beyond merely what subsistence can explain. And if you're acquiring beyond what mere subsistence requires, therefore you're locking yourself into this idea of acquiring wealth for its own sake, right? It becomes its own objective. Invidious comparison between the possessor of the honorific booty, in this case we're talking about Diego's cars, right? Diego, that's your honorific booty. It's the Bugatti parked in front of your house. And his less successful neighbors, I don't know why I put you, Mario, in the role of less successful neighbor. Apologize. Next time I'll flip it around. I like to dish out all the abuse here on an equal basis. Was no doubt present early as an element of the utility of the thing's success. So I just want to, the reason I'm putting it here is because the idea that the demonstration, right, creates then these gradations of what you call success or honor that are here. But as soon as this custom of individual ownership, right? So the custom of individual ownership establishes the foundations then for these kinds of gradations of honor to exist inside of our society. The invidious comparison, meaning comparison of worth, now becomes primarily a comparison of the owner with the other members of the group. Property is still of the nature of trophy, but with the cultural advance, it becomes more and more a trophy of successes scored in the game of ownership, carried on between the members of the group under the quasi-peaceable methods of nomadic life. So we're not going around and killing each other anymore. We're back to like as we were when we used to be small hunter-gatherers. But now as cultural has advanced, we've gone back, we've introduced then this notion of property as a marker for success. Is that clear, right? When he says it becomes more and more a trophy of success scored in the game of ownership carried on between the members of the group under the quasi-peaceable methods of nomadic life. So in other words, we've left that killing of our neighbors behind. Diego doesn't have to kill his neighbor anymore to show how big of a man he is. He just needs to buy a nice car, right? It serves the same thing. And Mario gets to keep his life, but now suffers from envy and desire to emulate. The possession of goods, whether acquired aggressively by one's own exertion or passively by transmission through inheritance from others, becomes a conventional basis of reputability. The possession of wealth, which was at the outset simply valued simply as an evidence of efficiency, becomes in popular apprehension itself a meritorious act. Wealth is now itself intrinsically honorable and confers honor on its possessor, right? So that creates an environment where we now link wealth effects, these are the Veblen effects, wealth effects, to the sense of dignity, worth, and honor, right? That's essentially what he's saying. Now, that's obviously not true for everybody. Some of us in this room might think, I don't care that much about it. But it's generally true. This is the point. There are obviously going to be some people who don't necessarily fall victim to this or get caught up in this. But generally speaking, it's true. And this is not because people are psychologically wired this way. It's because this is how the society itself is structured. So that once you have the principle of private ownership, the ownership itself creates the psychology to want to own. Whereas you may recall in one of the readings that we did earlier, remember that there was the person who gave gifts to some group who didn't know what to do with them because they had no concept of ownership. So therefore the idea of coveting a good meant nothing to them. So ownership creates this psychology. Carrying on. A certain standard of wealth in one case and of prowess in the other is a necessary condition of reputability. Anything in excess of the normal amount is meritorious. Here's what I want to draw your attention to. Those members of the community who fall short of this somewhat indefinite normal degree of prowess or of property suffer in the esteem of their fellow men, and consequently they suffer also in their own esteem. Usually the basis of self-respect is the respect accorded by one's neighbors. So therefore, as soon as the possession of property becomes the basis of popular esteem, so too is it requisite to what we call self-respect. Our whole understanding or image of ourselves in terms of what it means to be successful in this constructed social context then links back then to this, as it were, capacity to measure yourself with respect to your wealth. But that measurement only is valuable in the context of having something to measure against, which is how much wealth the other guy has got, right? Is that clear? Now, the interesting thing, and this comes back to my initial point, is that when you see somebody, when Mario drives by Diego's house and sees the Bugatti parked outside, is his first thought, okay, we're going to go and call his friends. He's like, Diego, it's going to be beat down time. We're taking this guy out and we're taking his Bugatti. Is that our primary reaction? It's like, let's get some guys. That guy is soon going to be minus one Bugatti, right? Is that how you're thinking? No. What does it create in our minds? What do we think when we see the guy with the nice car? Why is he buying in the first place? He knows what we're going to think, which is, I would like one too, right? Ooh, whatever it takes to get one of those. I want one of those, right? That kind of thing. That's the aspirational model, right? When you see this, you don't think revolution time, Diego's going down, you think aspiration time, Mario's going up, right? That's the notion. And so this is the effect, that this is the theory that Veblen wants to point us out to. That pecuniary emulation is not pecuniary revolution. It's not, say, a revolutionary mindset. It's not fair that other people have more money than I do. Instead, it's because other people have more money, I am inspired or incentivized to try and make my own wealth, right? To try and rise up the ranks. So that, in other words, it embeds, as a result of this psychology that derives from ownership, embeds a certain aspirational mindset, which is itself linked intimately with ownership itself. Ownership creates aspiration. Is that clear? So, you might think, well, let's see. Okay. So far as concerns the present question, the end, the goal sought by accumulation is to rank high in comparison with the rest of the community in point of pecuniary strength. So what's the best way for Mario, once he's got his own level of success, to get back at Diego? Buy 2 Bugattis, right? That's the kind of thing. Or maybe buy a McLennan or something, right? Or whatever those cars are called. Like something higher up. So then now Diego's going by Mario's house going, fuck that guy, right? And all of a sudden you're locked in. So long as the comparison is, I'm recording this lecture. I should keep the swear words down a little bit. So long as the comparison is distinctly unfavorable to himself, the normal will live in chronic dissatisfaction with his present lot. And when he has reached what may be called the normal pecuniary standard of the community, or of his class in the community, this chronic dissatisfaction will give place to a restless straining to place a wider and ever-widening pecuniary interval between himself and this average standard, which is just a complex way of saying that we are aspirational, right? That it's not like, oh, I'm fine, we will want more. That there is always a standard to which we can aspire. The invidious comparison can never become so favorable to the individual making it that he would not gladly rate himself still higher relative to his competitors in the struggle for pecuniary reputability. You can never have enough. The aspiration never ends because it's baked into the way that the society operates. So if you can read this paragraph and now understand it, you are ready to read Veblen, because this is the kind of typical nonsense or silly way that Veblen expresses himself. Takes perfectly good, ordinary ideas and puts them through whatever the Veblen machine is to create this kind of language coming out. But you can see it's worth making the effort because there's an important idea embedded in there. That the idea of property creates an aspirational mindset, and there is no point at which we then, as it were, renounce or give up that aspirational mindset because it is such an intimate or directly connected feature to the system of property in which we exist.
How did you say an aspirational
mindset? Relative success tested by an invidious pecuniary comparison with other men becomes the conventional end of action. Again, tested by an invidious pecuniary comparison, meaning Mario thinking about himself with respect to Diego. Who has more money? Who's got the bigger house, right? That kind of thing, all that stuff. The currently accepted legitimate end of effort becomes the achievement of a favorable comparison with other men. How do I know I'm doing well? Not because I'm maybe because I'm leading a happy life, but why am I leading a happy life? Because I've got more things than Diego. And he was my standard for success because he owns a Bugatti. And therefore, the repugnance to futility to a good extent coalesces with the incentive of emulation. It acts to accentuate the struggle for pecuniary reputability by visiting with a sharper disapproval all shortcoming and all evidence of shortcoming in point of view. So that's blah, 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 blah. Why did I highlight this? Purposeful effort comes to mean, yes, purposeful effort comes to mean primarily effort directed to or resulting in a more creditable showing of accumulated wealth. Among the motives which lead men to accumulate wealth, the primacy, both in scope and intensity, therefore, continues to belong to this motive of pecuniary emulation, right? Or aspiration, we might say. So the purposeful, in other words, wealth accumulation becomes its own goal. That's why you do it. Jeff Bezos did not found Amazon to make the world a better place, right? Instead, he founded Amazon to make himself an awful lot of money. Right? That's the idea. Our entrepreneurial effort, our creativity, is directed to ends that ultimately serve our own enrichment. And it's not because we are morally bankrupt or greedy. It's because we operate inside of a system in which that idea of aspiration is baked in. It's how we're, as it were, hardwired to think. Okay, there's really only one other critical point that I wanted to add to this. By the way, here's the this is where he defines invidious, right, is at the end of this chapter. The term is used in a technical sense as describing comparison of persons with a view to rating or grading them with respect of relative value or worth. Okay. The last point I wanted to draw attention to, which I guess actually is in the idea of conspicuous leisure. So let me talk a little about chapter 3 and 4, and we'll go in just a few minutes, because I got another class after this one. What does it mean? What does conspicuous mean? Conspicuous means to stand out. Right? So for example, if I say if you wanted to make something more conspicuous, you might use boldface or a different font or underline it or a different color, right? So the idea of something being conspicuous means it stands out, it's readily visible. So chapters 3 and 4 on conspicuous leisure, meaning not doing anything in a highly visible way, and conspicuous consumption, consuming things in a highly visible way, are the two elements. The conspicuous leisure chapter, as I say, because our own understanding of what it means to be in the sort of like the top strata of society has undergone this shift, is a little less relevant than it certainly was in Veblen's day. But I will draw your attention to what he says in one part of the chapter, which is that part of conspicuous leisure is the acquisition of things which demonstrate that you have leisure. So for example, horseback riding, or the ability to play tennis, or the ability to speak Latin, or things like this. Those all betray a kind of leisure. You have the time for these kinds of pursuits, and the purpose then of acquiring these skills is, at least as Veblen has it in his reckoning, is to make visible the leisure that you have. Since not everybody can come to your house and see you just like goofing around all the time, you then need to find ways, you need to codify the leisure that you represent in ways that are culturally intelligible to other people who see you. And this is what the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu calls habitus, or the field of action that we have. And Bourdieu's insight, sort of similar to what Veblen's talking about here, is that there's a reason why, depending on the class into which you are born, will define what kind of environment you're comfortable with. People who are born into a very cultured household will feel very comfortable going to the opera or things like this. People who are, whereas they won't feel very comfortable, I don't know, playing dice on the streets or something like this. That's a very, that's come to my head, but anyway, whatever it might be. But the point about it is that if you think about it, there is in absolute terms no difference in terms of cultural value between reading, speaking Latin, something like this, and like speaking, I don't know, say some Romansh or whatever it might be. But we grant these things a cultural value based on the sociological foundations that are there. And so this becomes part of, in other words, conspicuous leisure involves acquiring the demonstration or demonstrating the signs that you are part of that class, right? The way you dress, the way you speak, the things you read, the kinds of vacations that you take, right? All of those then become markers, class markers. But for Veblen, they're not just random class markers. The chief characteristic of them as class markers is they speak to the fact that you do not have to work with your hands. You're not engaged in this kind of activity, the activity of working. Now, as I say, that has somewhat declined in our own day and age. But I want to finish up by going to, let me see if I can find it. He talks about waste. Let me see if I can, what happened? I pressed the wrong button. How do I do it? It's Control F, right?
Yeah.
Control F, waste. The pervading principle and abiding test of good breeding is the requirement of a substantial waste of time. Did you work hard this morning? Absolutely not at all. Good for you. Anyway, okay. There's lots of good stuff in this text. Okay. They are better fitted for this work as showing a larger waste of time and human energy. Let's see if I can find wasted effort. Conspicuous waste, right? So if you find this demands of just evidence of wasted effort. If you sort of go through the text, here's a thing where he talks about waste. From the foregoing survey of the growth of conspicuous leisure and consumption, it appears that the utility of both alike for the purposes of reputability lies in the element of waste that is common to both. And he says in the one case it's waste of time and effort, in the other case it is a waste of goods. I just want to finish up on this point because it ties back nicely to Diego's Bugatti, which is parked in his thing. That's a waste when he buys a car like that, right? Because the utility of a car is to facilitate transport for moving from one point to another. So if you can achieve that, right, if you can achieve that end at a certain amount, right, whatever the price of the good is, anything above that amount is in the Veblen sense, and he draws attention later in his text to the fact that he's using the word waste in a technical sense. It's a waste. Similarly, if you buy yourself a business class ticket to fly between, say, I don't know, Paris and New York, the amount that you're paying for your business class ticket is waste in this sense, because it's not serving any kind of a productive end, right? You could just as easily buy yourself a economy class ticket. You'll still get from Paris to New York. So the purpose of buying a business class ticket, all that additional expense, is in the demonstration that you can, right? Essentially, and that's what he's referring to as waste. So the entire luxury market, right? This idea that we have of ourselves to mark ourselves as successful by consuming certain products, that the hallmark of success is, as we become more successful, to become more wasteful in the goods that we consume. And the very successful are the most wasteful at all. At some point, you stop flying business class and just buy your own goddamn jet to fly where you need to be. Even though there's, you could certainly fly a commercial airliner. But the point about it is that the commercial jet is like it represents all of that extra waste, and that then goes to signify your being part of this class, right? And so this concept of waste then is embedded becomes the nature of consumption. Success, or the marker of success in our society, let's summarize it this way. The marker of success in this kind of society is found in the degree to which your consumption is a waste or wasteful, right? Is that clear? So if, for example, you just buy a Honda Civic and you're only ever flying like Ryanair, right? That's very utilitarian, very basic. On the other hand, if you're buying a very, very expensive car and you're only ever flying business class, it's the same service. The good that's being provided is the same. But all that addition, at least for Veblen, is considered waste. But it's not waste in the sense like, oh, isn't that a waste? You shouldn't do it. It's not a moral judgment, because it makes you feel better. And the reason you feel better is not because you get all the perks of business class. That may be part of it. But the bigger part of it is knowing that all the people in the back do not, right? That's where it derives from. This is where the value is. And so for Veblen, this is the kind of chief characteristic, is that a nature of consumption that's built around the notion of waste. So let's try and bring some threads together here. He's got one last point, which I won't bother finding in the text, but he's got one last point, which says, when we engage in this example of invidious comparison, meaning I compare my worth to somebody else, who do you compare yourself to? You don't sit here and say, okay, Jeff Bezos is the world's richest man, or maybe it's Bill Gates, whoever it is, or it's like some Saudi prince. I'm going to compare myself to them. No. You compare yourself to the person who's next above you, right? So if you're like leading a nice middle-class lifestyle, you're going to compare yourself to somebody who's leading a slightly nice middle-class lifestyle. If you're driving like a BMW 300 series, you're comparing yourself to the guy who's driving a 500 BMWs, right? That's the way it works. We compare ourselves, or the invidious nature of the comparison is one grade above. That's what we aspire to. None of us in this room aspires, perhaps, well, maybe in an abstract sense, but we're not worried, we're not envious of a Jeff Bezos. It's too far out of sight, it's incomprehensible. But we might have that sense of relative worth compared to a slightly more successful friend or acquaintance or neighbor or relative or something like this. And that's a fundamental detail, because what does that mean? It means that your aspirations are always within reach, right? You're not thinking the only way to be successful is to have a private jet and own private islands in the Caribbean. No. There is always a mechanism of success that actually is within your reach. The mechanism, like success, means having a slightly nicer house, or a bigger car, or better clothes, or something like this. And so it maps that aspirational psychology onto every single individual in a way that those aspirations can then express themselves. And entire industries exist, entire careers exist, manipulating people, consumers, based on this underlying truism of aspirational consumption. How many products are sold to you precisely for their, as it were, wasteful characteristics? And the answer is an awful lot, because the more you can get someone to buy something that's got all these wasteful characteristics, the more money they're willing to pay for it, and the more valuable, and therefore the greater profit that you make, right? So that's the point about this nature of that he draws our attention to, is that the theory of the leisure class, that the upper class represents a kind of an ideal. but that there is this element of success that's reproduced all the way down. And no matter where you are, there's going to be some aspirational model that's within reach, whether you're at the very bottom socioeconomically or whether you're way up at the top, right? The only way to not have that sense of aspiration is if you're literally the wealthiest guy. There's no one above you. And look at all the competition every year between billionaires to see where they rank on the list, the Forbes list of billionaires, right? And apparently they give a shit if they move up and down that list, whereas the rest of us like, you have a fucking $1 billion, why do you give a shit, right? But they obviously do. Why? Because this kind of thinking still is pervasive in their mindset. And so the last point that I want to make, and this is going to set up our discussion coming forward, is think what capitalism then has done, right? Here we've been going back to like the foundations of settled communities, saying that as soon as we have private ownership, we've created this competition for wealth, created this idea of the aspirational mindset. We always aspire to something more than we are, created the invidious comparison. So that goes way, 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 way back, right? 10,000 years. But what did capitalism do? Capitalism created huge swaths of new things to consume, did it not? Right? It changed, as it were, the fundamental consumption landscape that we live in. And so our capacity to express ourselves aspirationally has never been greater. We can express ourselves aspirationally now in terms of the shoes that we wear or the clothes that we buy, in terms of the phone that we use or the computer that we have, as well as the cars that we drive, the vacations that we take, which airlines we choose to fly. In other words, there's almost nothing out there as a kind of fundamental element of consumption, which foods we choose to eat at, right, that cannot in some way satisfy this idea of the aspirational mindset that's developed within this. And once people are busy consuming and aspiring, right, what are they not doing? They're not setting fire to the system. They're not trying to drag the system down. Because from the point of view of our psychology, the system is giving us what we crave. The goods, the services, the lifestyle, etc., that fulfills this aspirational psychology that we simply are brought up with, that we cannot avoid. And capitalism has done that better than any system that has hitherto existed. That was another insight of Marx, that capitalism has created this extraordinary world of consumer goods. People could have more things under this mode of production than they ever could have before. But what he, I think, failed to perceive is that once you switch from thinking of yourself as a producer working for the man to a consumer consuming for yourself, then you're almost inevitably going to be wrapped up inside of the Veblen effect, which is whatever I have, I want it more or better, right? Or in some sort of higher quality, etc. And there's never a point, except when you die or become incompetent, that sense stops. And so we get locked inside of this market system where it is only through the market, right, where we can now express, or let me rephrase it, because it's not only through the market, but in the context of our now being subordinate to the market, even though it completely defines who we are and strips us of our liberty to be anything but that, because it satisfies this underlying aspirational need that property itself creates, we accept the underlying logic and we play according to the rules of that game. And that, at least I think in part, has been a very critical reason why, despite Marx's prediction 170 years ago, not only has the system not undergone a revolutionary paradigm shift into a world without private property and a world without extreme wealth effects between different segments, instead it's gotten worse, that the wealth gradations or the wealth effects or wealth distribution effects have gotten much more extreme. But that's okay, because that simply reinforces the sort of underlying aspirational psychology that's here. So when we come back next time, we will explore the mechanisms that turned us from producers into consumers. How did this happen, that we ended up adopting an aspirational consumer mindset? That's going to be the next stop in this material. Meanwhile, I'll let you go. Thank you very much. And I will see you guys not next week, but I believe in 2 weeks.